Thank you for joining me tonight for this edition of Protestia Tonight. I am your host, David Morrow, representing the team and the staff and all the troublemakers over at Protestia.com. Appreciate you tuning in. Now, I have to be totally straight with you. This program is not live, despite the fact that you're probably watching a live stream. So if you're chatting, don't expect me to respond to the chat. I'm not going to pull that up because I'm not even going to see it. But tonight we have a special guest talking about, we're going to be discussing the Southern Baptist Convention, the fallout from the 2022 annual meeting, which we were both at, myself and this guest. I guess I might as well introduce you now, Rod, since people are going to start guessing now. I have Rod Martin, formerly of the Southern Baptist Convention Executive Committee, tech entrepreneur extraordinaire and expert on all things that I wish I was more of an expert on. So I'd like to welcome Rod to the program. How are you doing?
Good to be here. Thank you.
You bet. So now we normally at the top of Protestia programming, we do a little bit of bookkeeping, but people know that they can subscribe and support us if they would like to over at patreon.com/Protestia. Of course, head over to Protestia.com for all of the latest in discernment and polemics news. Now, those of you that have been watching for a while know that I am a member at a faithfully giving Southern Baptist church. So, of course, Southern Baptist issues hit particularly close to home for me, and that is going to be the topic that we will be discussing here tonight. But before we get to that, because more important than the Southern Baptist Convention, more important than the politics of it all and the characters involved and all of the just seemingly endless stream of nonsense and trouble that we have to deal with the SBC, more important than all of that, of course, is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's should be the reason that any parachurch organization like the SBC exists. It is the reason that the church exists. And the gospel of Jesus Christ, of course, is, your friends or your parents or things like that might have told you at some point that you're just the most perfect person in the world. You're just wonderful. Everything you do is great. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Not only is that not the case, it's even worse than that. You were offending a holy and righteous God from the time you were born. The Bible teaches that we were born into sin. We were lost and separated from God and deserving of eternal punishment. And if you read the Bible literally like I do, that's eternal punishment in hell. And yet God loved the world so much, he sent his only son, Jesus Christ, to pay that price instead. The Bible teaches, according to the scriptures, that Jesus was born of a virgin. He lived a perfect life that you and I could not live, earning righteousness on our behalf, and went to the cross to pay the price that we should have paid. He died a death that to pay the price to the Father and redeem for himself a people, and that will include everybody who places their faith and hope and trust in Jesus Christ, repents of their sins, and turns to him for salvation. That the gift of eternal life can be yours if you place your faith, hope, and trust in Jesus Christ. If you have questions about that, please let us know. Now, I almost always, well, I shouldn't say almost always, but sometimes I forget to mention that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. So he died on that cross. On the third day was raised from the dead, proving he was God, conquering death, proving that his sacrifice was accepted. He ascended to heaven and now sits at the right hand of the Father. If you have questions about that, please reach out to us. You can message us here. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, all over the place. We would love to have a conversation about Jesus and the real gospel. There are a lot of false gospels out there, and fortunately, the real one is not that complicated. But it is the most extraordinary message that you will hear from this program, or really any program you will ever listen to. Now, to the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, I was to put this a little bit into context, I met Rob for the first time in person at the Conservative Baptist Network breakfast, just for 2 seconds, and I was glad to be there. Delicious breakfast. Nice to be in a room where I was pretty sure everybody there was pretty aligned with me theologically. That was nice, because just going to Anaheim and seeing everything there was like, this is it. It's a little bit of a foreign territory for those of us that didn't grow up SBC. That not going to meetings and things like that. So, Yeah, and now we're sitting in the wake of the meeting, right? It's over now, and unfortunately, it seems like things didn't quite go our way. What say you, Rod?
Well, they certainly didn't. No question about that. It was a tough beat, and not for lack of good candidates. Tom Askell did a fantastic job running for president. Bodie Bauckham for president of the Pastors Conference. Javier Chavez for recording secretary. These are good men. They're great preachers, and I was honored to get to work for them and try to help them win. The reality in the convention is, the people who make the rules are the people who show up, and we didn't have quite enough people show up. There are a great many people. I'd estimated in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 4,000 people who are going to be at every Southern Baptist convention, come hell or high water. They are denominational employees. They are, NAM church planters. They're people who have been in the past or would like to be in the future. They are people who absolutely 100% are going to back the platform, no matter what. And we knew that going in, and we knew that going to Anaheim, California meant that it was going to be very hard for people to get out there. And we've talked about that on the show here with you. So, the reality is, if we'd had about 1,000 to 2,000 more people present, we'd had a really good shot. I think we'd probably won, but airfare is high. I mean, I bought my ticket about a week before the convention because I was juggling travel plans, so I had to buy late. And oh my goodness, it was insane. And gasoline isn't much better. I mean, I think Biden's getting us toward $20 a gallon or something. So, it's hard for people to go. And we ended up with about 8,000 messengers, of whom a little less than 7,000 actually voted in the room. Well, do the math, 3,000 to 4,000 guaranteed votes for the other team. If a little over 6,000 are voting, we're going to lose. And that's exactly what happened. That is not a commentary on where the average Southern Baptist is. The average Southern Baptist in the pew, we don't have to speculate about that. We know how they vote. They don't show up and vote at Southern Baptist conventions, but they absolutely vote in national elections, and we see how they vote. 86% of Southern Baptists consistently vote conservative. They are not woke, not by any stretch of the imagination. So the challenge as we go into next year's convention in New Orleans, Louisiana, very central, very easy for people to drive from wherever they may be, unless they're in California, pretty much. Our challenge there is to keep getting the message out. We have grown as a conservative Baptist network all of the 2 years that we've been active now. We've been at this for just a little over 2 years. The organizing has gone well. The chapters have grown. The number of leaders involved has increased. We're starting to get megachurch pastors. You saw Jack Graham endorsed Tom Askell right before the convention, which I thought was extraordinary. That was just kind of out of the blue. Jack's a great man, but certainly doesn't agree with Tom Askell on a lot of things. Certainly soteriology and other things. And that's a former SBC president, senior pastor of one of the largest churches in the country, comes out for Tom right at the end. We had a bunch of pastors who wouldn't even pay attention to us at all a year earlier, who got out there. And I was especially pleased. I don't know if you had the opportunity to hear it, but Mike Stone, who was our candidate the year before, gave the nominating speech for Tom. That is absolutely the best nominating speech I've ever heard for any candidate. I've been going to the Southern Baptist Convention. This was my 31st Southern Baptist Convention, and I've never heard a speech like Tom Askell's, or rather for Mike Stone's for Tom Askell.
Yeah, I was there.
So a lot was right. A lot went well. We just didn't ultimately have the numbers. And I have to say our floor operation was extraordinary. We had some tremendous people working the microphones, getting questions asked, getting motions made, doing the deed. We just didn't have the turnout at the end of the day. And I think we can get there in New Orleans, and I think we can stay there once this gets rolling. It's taken a while to develop it. Movements don't happen overnight, but it's going in the right direction, and I feel good about it. At the same time, and I'm sure we'll get to this as the show progresses, the SBC is not headed in the right direction at all. And a bunch of what happened in Anaheim shows that we were right all along to be concerned. They are in danger, the people on the platform, of taking the thing off the cliff it has been in a bad direction for a long time. You guys have chronicled that extremely well. But what happened in Anaheim, I think, was an eye opener for everybody.
Well, I think that the floor game by the conservative pastors and those associated with the Conservative Baptist Network had that effect to an extent. It exposed things. I mean, the challenge to the ERLC, the challenge to the Credentials Committee, those kind of things, the Rick Warren stunt, all of that, like regular Southern Baptists that didn't attend the meeting, they weren't there as messengers, they saw all this, right? So if nothing else, I think it was beneficial in that it's drawing the line more clearly on these issues and demonstrating that it's not like the issue to issue, people are all over the place. It's reliable. The people that are on the left side of issue A or on the left side of issue B or on the left side of issue C, left side of issue D. And it's important to understand that because it exposes that there's more going on than just an individual issue here or there. There's underlying doctrine, there's underlying beliefs that are driving this wedge. I was arguing that there's a growing divide, and certainly a more obvious divide now between regular pew sitting Southern Baptists and the SBC elites, as you say, the platform, and those that are institutionally connected. And now the question that people are asking is why am I still funding this? Why is my church still funding this? And that's a concern. Would you recommend that that churches or church members be careful with exactly where they send, if they still want to have a voice in the convention? Because as far as I understand, you don't have to just send it generally to the CP anymore. You can actually send to specific organizations and dodge things like the ERLC and NAM if you want to, and these kind of things.
Yes, you absolutely can, and much more so than it was in the past. In the 80s, the conservative resurgence guys really had some hard choices to make because they didn't have the flexibility that we have now. But the SBC Constitution was amended, I want to say, in about 2015. And we can debate the wisdom of some of what they did there, but it made it very easy for churches to choose the specific SBC ministries they want to support, perhaps a particular set of missionaries overseas or whatever it is that they feel comfortable and conscience-driven to pursue, and fund that. And as long as you dot the I's and cross the T's on it, it still counts for messengers. So I encourage people, if you can't feel comfortable giving to cooperative program in quite the way you used to, and I can understand that. I'm not saying people should do that. I'm merely saying I know a lot of people who feel that way. If that's how you feel, it's not hard to support things you can in good conscience support and still keep your messenger count. And in fact, my church has kind of done that inadvertently. It's not really because they are trying to defund anything. It's just because they have an extremely strong foreign missions emphasis. We have about 9 Southern Baptist missionaries, some through IMB, some not, just in our own church of about 300. So we've got a huge emphasis on international missions. We even have a family in Papua New Guinea that had been translating the Bible into a language that heretofore had never had a Bible. So we've got all these things going on, and IMB missionaries as well. And so we have funded a tremendous amount of international missions, and it just happens to work out that the way they've done it qualifies them for a full slate of messengers, which they didn't realize because until recently they hadn't been sending that many messengers. But it turns out they're qualified for 12, which is the maximum anybody could have. So we've got a church of 300, and it would still be true if you had a church of 30. Yeah, and you can have the same number of messengers as any megachurch. They can never have more than 12, and depending on how you do it, a tiny church can have that same 12. So if Baptists in the pew will just rise up and do the stewardship work that is required of us, this is the Lord's money, these are the Lord's institutions, they don't have to let it go off that cliff. They can rescue it. It is in our power to do it. We just have to choose to do so. And God will give the victory if we will be faithful.
Yeah, it was interesting to me when you were speaking at the CBN breakfast, that it seemed like, and now that I have you, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like you didn't draw, and maybe this is just strategy, but you didn't draw any sort of line in the sand where, hey, once it gets beyond this point, we're going to go build something else. It was, basically, if I could paraphrase, it was something like, we'll be here this year and the next year and the next year and the next year, which, obviously, I mean, I appreciate the passion for sure, but there's got to be some line in the sand, some place we draw and say, once it gets to this point, we can't be a part of this anymore. And it's okay because God doesn't need this. And we can rebuild something else. There can be a place for faithful churches that aren't woke to cooperate with one another.
Well, of course we could. I'm not suggesting that's impossible, but I am suggesting this. And look, I'm a lawyer by training, so I think in terms of bylaws, and I realize that makes everybody else yawn and go to sleep. But the reality is, if you're talking about Baylor, there's not really much of anything you can do. They have a self-perpetuating board, which means the board appoints its own successors. If you're talking about Harvard, same thing. You're not going to be able to make a difference at Harvard. That's not going to happen. By contrast, and by the way, the Catholic Church, same thing. Unless you're going to personally start appointing cardinals, you're not going to change anything. But with the Southern Baptist Convention, it's completely different, because if a majority for anything shows up in a given year at a 2-day business meeting, it can change the direction. Now, how much it can change the direction depends on if it'll show up the next year and the next and the next, because the way our system works, no one president gets to appoint more than a few of the, and it's an indirect process on top of that, but no one president is going to be able to appoint, for instance, an entire board of trustees. That's not going to happen. So he's going to have to serve 2 years, and then you're going to have to elect another one who serves 2 years, and maybe another one who serves 2 years. In the 80s, they were doing some trial and error, and they didn't have everything sorted just so it took them a little longer than I think it could take us now. And frankly, then it's taken J.D. Greer and Ed Litton. Those guys moved very, very smartly and moved the dial on every board of trustees very fast. So it can be quicker now, but it's not instant. But as long as it's true that a majority can show up in a room, we've got 14 million Southern Baptists. We've got about 6,000 to 8,000 who normally go to a convention. If a few thousand more show up, it completely changes everything. So no, this isn't the sort of thing you give up on. This is the sort of thing you double down on. It's a no-brainer. This is the most impactful institution that the Lord has in the United States, which is the most impactful country in the world. We've got 6 seminaries that educate 1/3 of all of the seminary students in the United States. Those aren't going away. If we go away, they're still there. And you think, well, those seminaries won't be educating that many students if we're gone. Wrong you are, because 100 years ago, when the liberals took over the Presbyterian Church USA, you'd have thought that Machen leaving and going to start Westminster Seminary, Westminster would be bigger. But even today, right this minute, Princeton Seminary is still educating more seminary students than Westminster Theological Seminary. After a full century of building, Princeton is still bigger. So no, if you want to turn over the future of countless pulpits all around the world, mission fields, churches, everything, if you want to turn that over to the people you most disagree with, just leave the Southern Baptist Convention. If you want to recapture those institutions for faithfulness and integrity and orthodoxy, you're going to have to stand and fight. And that means showing up at the annual meeting.
It does seem to me that a lot of the seminaries have been a lot further to the left than we've thought for a long time. So at this point, my concern with it is how many pastors currently in pews that came out of these seminaries and from these backgrounds were already indoctrinated into a lot of leftist ideology without anybody. And now we're just starting to wake up and figure out this is going on. Because that's, a lot of leftist ideology and communism entered the Western countries this way. They entered through academia. and through.
Oh, you're exactly right.
Where there was not, people protect their families, they protect their localities. They're not necessarily paying attention to colleges and sort of these erudite spaces that most people don't occupy.
I think you can make a case that Southeastern is our worst offender at the moment.
Yeah.
There are clearly some problems at Southern. We could spend some time on that. You could point to problems at Southwestern. You could point to problems elsewhere. The reality is, with the possible exception of Southeastern, none of these are as far gone as they all were in 1980. We are still in a position where you can get a good seminary education with some problems at any of those institutions, probably even Southeastern, to a degree that was impossible in 1975 or 1985. The problem we're facing is that every year we're electing a president who is going to continue the trend of appointments that we've seen the past few years. Each of those institutions is moving further left at breakneck speed, and you're going to see that in hiring. A lot of these presidents are not young. They're going to be replaced by these left-wing trustees, and you're about to see that at the executive committee, of course, as well. So, we're going to have some real problems before it gets better that are greater than what we've seen so far. And I do want to circle back to what we saw on the floor. We actually had the female chairman of the SBC Credentials Committee get up on the podium and tell us that her committee is unable to define the word pastor. This is not actually a controversial term. We've actually had it for like 2,000 years or so. And we certainly have had it for 20 plus years in the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. Al Mohler got up at the microphone, and God love him, everything he said about this was spot on. He said, because he was on the committee that drafted the current edition of the Baptist Faith and Message with Paige Patterson and a bunch of these other guys. And it was designed to be big enough tent to include Calvinists and non-Calvinists, but to be a minimum standard that everybody would agree to and uphold. And Al said from the microphone, we chose the word pastor specifically because absolutely no one disagreed on what it meant. Well, now our credentials committee isn't certain that it actually means what everybody knows it means. So when Saddleback appoints a bunch of female pastors, including a lead teaching pastor side by side with her husband in replacement for Rick Warren himself as he retires, the Credentials Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention no longer knows if pastor is a big enough word to encompass her from a confessional standpoint. Well, that is idiotic. Yeah, that is absolute nonsense.
Saddleback found in true postmodern market-driven fashion, they found a loophole, or I would say like a little bit of a rope-a-dope. So they say on one hand, okay, if you read the applicable passage, because the word pastor is not found, very, like much in the New Testament.
Sure,
it's listed with gifts. So they say, well, pastor could indicate a gift rather than an office. But then at the same time, they are completely ignoring the idea that in Baptist churches, the office the role defines the office, right? So if you're acting as an elder, as a teacher, as an under shepherd, you are a pastor, whether you call yourself that or not. So they twisted it around to the point and created enough confusion that, I mean, we're standing up there saying we don't know if there's a connection between the office of pastor and the term pastor. Well, the term pastor simply means elder, overseer, bishop. That's just all it means. It's not that complicated.
And everyone understands that. The only people who don't understand that are people who are too young to know anything or old enough to have learned how to lie.
Right.
I mean, it's completely ridiculous. Everybody understood this. And Al, God love him, I disagree with Al Mohler every so often, we'll say.
I call it
in
good
that
Al
moment,
and bad Al. We saw good Al in that moment. Bad Al is the one that gave us Russell Moore and Danny Aiken and Adam Greenway. That's and these other characters. That's bad Al.
But good Al showed up, and God love him for that. And his remarks were spot on. And that brings us to the man you just mentioned, Adam Greenway, who in that same debate, and this is the second of three especially bad things that came out of Anaheim. The second one is Adam's take, which I'm going to try to compress down to a simple idea. The idea of the Baptist faith and message is that it is a minimum standard that all of us hold to. How do you define what is a Southern Baptist? Well, look at the Baptist faith and message. This is the minimum we all agree to. There's plenty of room to disagree within it. You don't have to agree on many things, even things as fundamental as soteriology. You can have a range of belief and still be consistent with the BFM, because the BFM is a lowest common denominator document. This is what we all agree to. Adam Greenway got up and offered an amendment in that debate, if you'll recall, which basically said, no, the Baptist faith and message is a buffet. Mm-hmm. Take what you want, leave out what you don't. What? That is exactly where we were 40 years ago with the old school moderates, which of course was their own word for liberal, left of Stalin. The moderates told us the exact same thing about the Baptist faith and message in 1963, which is why we amended it in 2000. So we're back to that, and the battle lines are pretty clearly drawn now. You have the minimum confessional standard approach versus the Western sizzling buffet approach, where just believe what you want. It's all loosey-goosey, no big deal.
Try to throw the BF&M 2000 under the bus by saying we're not creedal. This is a creed, and throw it on the bus. Like, what's the definitional difference between a creed and a confession?
Well, we just don't need definitions anymore. That's just not very winsome. So that's basically where we are, and that brings us to the third thing, which was the next day. We get Tony Evans up there pitching kingdom race theology, which, wait, what are the initials on there? Oh, yes, KRT. Okay, that's CRT, but with a K. That's all it is. They've added some Christianese. They've baptized the language a little bit. But what we're doing is we're saying, oh, you didn't like critical race theory as an analytical tool. Oh, well, we'll make it KRT, and now it's all better.
And I mean, this is what Ed Litton's entire his sort of special ministry focus is born of racial reconciliation, and I find it ironic because when he determined that was going to be a primary focus, Ed Litton's primary focus would be on racial reconciliation, was in the wake of the hands up don't shoot lie with Michael Brown. It was right after that, and people were upset about it, and rather than Ed Litton saying, just so that's not what happened, you don't need to be upset, you like this isn't, he didn't stick his hands up and then got shot. He didn't say that. He just ran with it. I've termed this term lately emotional justice. I think that's what it was. It's if somebody feels that way,
that covers it.
Yeah, if somebody feels that way, then justice is defined by the feelings of whoever's involved, and he fell right into that. And he still,
and of course, that's a lot of what we saw in the Sex Abuse Task Force's report too. Mm-hmm. And that was, I don't want to get too deeply into that because it's in the weeds, it's inside baseball, a lot of it. That would need a different show. But if we're going to talk about it briefly, I think it's fair to say this: as an officer and then regular member after I got booted out for being the way I am, I supported and voted for the investigation. And I voted to fully fund it because we needed to have an investigation. The world was coming unglued. There was real crisis of confidence in the moral authority of the executive committee. Without an investigation, you were never going to put it to bed. And if there really was any wrongdoing, it needed to be exposed. And some wrongdoing was exposed, and I'm glad that's true. But the reality of that investigation is becoming more and more apparent the further we go on. And Megan Basham's reporting has just been groundbreaking on that. The reality is the Guidepost showed its hand the week before the convention when it put up that pride flag on Twitter and made very clear Guidepost Solutions is nothing but an LGBTQIA plus activist group masquerading as investigators. And Rachel Den Hollander has hitched her wagon to them and gone around all over in the evangelical world, tearing groups up, basically to set them up for the giant class action suit coming. And what we saw in the Guidepost report, which did some good, they absolutely pointed out some things that needed fixing, some people who did some wrong, no question about that. The biggest single thing they got right was the dysfunction of our staff system, how our staff at various entities, but especially the EC, is just hiding things right and left from the trustees where they can't give meaningful oversight. That has to fix. That is part of what we're calling changing the direction. But the reality is the Guidepost report was completely informed by radical feminism and by queer theory and by all of the various subsets of what we know broadly as critical theory. Take, for instance, the Hannah Kate Williams allegation the night before the election in 2021 that Mike Stone had verbally assaulted her. Mm-hmm. Well, there are about 5 eyewitnesses who can tell you that that never happened. So guess what Guidepost said about it? Not one word. This is the sitting chairman of the executive committee supposedly verbally assaulting a sex abuse victim who appeared on the floor with Grant Gaines the next day weeping to try to get the whole sex abuse task force motion passed. This is possibly the most abusive moment in Southern Baptist life, if true. And Guidepost didn't even address it to say it did happen or it didn't happen because they knew it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And they absolutely refused under any circumstances to question the word of an alleged victim. So they didn't speak of it at all because they knew it was a lie. And it seems the same thing happened with the Jennifer Lyle thing in a different way. I'm not saying Jennifer lied. I'm not getting into that, but they refused to even interview her accused. She has accused David Sills of sexually assaulting her for 12 solid years. Megan Lively is on Twitter saying that there's documentary evidence he raped her for 12 years. Guidepost did not interview him. He was not on the list to be interviewed, nor did he decline an interview. And I have spoken to a person who has recently spoken to him who says that he absolutely was not contacted by them, offered them information they would not take. I know of other people who were talked about in the report who offered information that was needed for the investigation. Guidepost had already written their story. They did not take the evidence.
It becomes standpoint theory. They say, well, he's the accused and people are accusing him of this, so we can't believe anything he says. Conversely, the accuser, we must believe everything by default. And in fact, if you question it, well, you're being voyeuristic. You're re-abusing them. You're re-traumatizing them. It's such a non-biblical standard for justice. And it seemed to me, and you know, correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, but it seemed to me like the two big bombshells in this report were still he said, she said kind of situations. They weren't, we couldn't actually say for certain this was abuse with either one of them. Well, the single
biggest one, I would say, is the allegation that Johnny Hunt raped that woman. Well, I know he did something he shouldn't have done because he confessed and resigned his job. So, okay. But he denies he did anything that was coercive. Okay, well, I don't know if he did or he didn't because they didn't really investigate it. They took her word. They did nothing that could constitute a so-called investigation of that.
There were circumstances. There were circumstances around that at least for me don't pass the smell test.
It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
This woman's husband did after this. Can you imagine if it was your wife? I know if it was my wife, this would have not been my reaction. But like,
I would not have reacted the way he did.
It's fine. No. I won't say anything. Like, it just doesn't pass the smell test for me.
It really doesn't. If Johnny raped her, now if Johnny just had sex with her, or just was in the condo alone with her when he shouldn't have been, and you know, that's a no-brainer. He shouldn't have done that. But whatever it was, okay, his reaction makes sense. The point is, they labeled him a rapist, and they did not have any supporting evidence for that other than she kind of sort of said it. And I stress kind of sort of. Okay. Likewise, you know, not even interviewing David Sills, but labeling him basically a rapist. a 12-year serial rapist. Well, look, if he is that, they have a duty. They have a duty to get him out of circulation. This is a dangerous man. And if he didn't do it, what are they doing labeling him that? So, we actually, I don't want to get off too far into the weeds on that, other than to say that report had some serious issues with it, which I don't think any of us really fully understood until Megan Basham started doing some investigative reporting on it. And then we've had a number of bloggers do some pretty solid work on that. And Mark Coppinger did some solid work on that and talked about it from the microphone on the floor. But the big thing there that I would encourage people with is that the result of that work was that the task force toned down some of the recommendations that they were otherwise going to shove on everybody. And what we passed actually was not terrible. I mean, the reforms, so-called, that were passed actually have some potential to do some good. If they're implemented well, there will be an implementation task force.
This is basically the task force saying, let's take another year, and these are our suggestions. Let's discuss it, right? I mean, there's nothing that's actually concrete yet.
And that's reasonable. And look, this needs to be talked about and thought about. What they're asking for, at the extreme end, would utterly transform the SBC in ways that could potentially be very dangerous, from a local church perspective. I mean, so much so that at the extreme end, if you were to adopt some of what Guidepost said, there's a direct path to where if you have a slip and fall at the executive committee in Nashville, your local church may have to pay for it in court. I mean, or vice versa. I mean, it's completely crazy. And of course, completely violates our church polity. And you've got a bunch of LGBTQIA plus activists trying to redesign our church polity. That's just crazy. And that's part of why they backed off a little bit, because suddenly there was a lot of pressure from people who weren't widely identified with the Conservative Baptist Network that, wait, what are you doing? I mean, we had a bunch of state conventions cut ties with Guidepost, or in the alternative, put out hurried statements that, hey, we never had any ties to Guidepost. Well, yeah, I would think so. So on balance, what came out of that was actually pretty decent. It's not quite as I would have it, but at least to me, being there, it seemed to be a non-issue compared to some of these other things that ended up taking center stage. Yeah. Yes,
and look, because the overall report, I know. I mean, everybody put out statements saying, "I'm horrified by this. This is the worst thing ever. It's an apocalypse." If you listen to Russell Moore, and I'm reading this thing saying, aside from Guidepost having no respect at all for Baptist polity, none whatsoever, there wasn't even a concern
or any apparent understanding of it.
Right. But beyond that, it's like this is not the systemic issue that it was made out to be when Hannah Kate was crying next to Grant Gaines last year. And we all jumped on board saying, maybe this is a lot worse than we thought. It isn't. And that's good. That's a good thing. I mean, every instance of abuse is bad, but it's not systemic.
Well, I like I said, I voted for the investigation at the executive committee and to fully fund it. I opposed waiving attorney-client privilege, which was just literally crazy, and violated all of our legal duties. It was completely absurd and wrong. But we would not have learned a thing, less or more, had we not waived privilege. You've heard a lot of people on social media claim, oh, well, we wouldn't have learned about this secret database if we hadn't waived privilege. Bunk. That's absolutely ridiculous, because first of all, if there had been an actual secret database, that would have been found regardless of attorney-client privilege. You can't use attorney-client privilege to cover up substantive details like that.
But the second thing is, database pretty much just a collection of news clippings? That's what it seemed to me. Like, this is stuff anybody could have found on Google. Right.
Sing Oldham had some Google alerts for sex abuse cases. So Google sends him an email every now and then saying, well, here's a news story about a sex abuse case. Yeah. And he forwarded them to Augie Bodo. This is a database? Are you kidding me? And these are things that are already in the public domain. Half of them weren't even Southern Baptist. And by the time Guidepost looks at it, out of 700 names in all of those press clippings, only two of them are still in ministry that are Southern Baptists. So, okay, the executive committee doesn't have any power over that. And if we have those press clippings, you may rest assured that somebody filed a complaint against the churches that employ those guys with the credentials committee. So where was the failure? Where is the cover up? It's mind-numbing nonsense. But at the same time, did we need an investigation to get to the bottom of that? Well, after the bombs that Russell Moore dropped with his fake leaked letters, yes, we absolutely needed an investigation to clear the air. And honest people, I think at this point, looking at it, have to say the air has largely been cleared. This is not as it was advertised. Praise God. Because if there had been a bunch of sex abuse, Russell was claiming there were children being raped at the executive committee building. I mean, this is utter nonsense. I don't know when there's been a child in the executive committee building, but if there were, apparently Ronnie Floyd and Augie Bodo were personally raping them in front of a bunch of trustees. It's crazy. And if you've got an allegation like that from a credible source, well, yeah, you got to have an investigation. So we did, and it was a lie. Russell Moore is a liar, as I said he was.
Do you think there's any chance that he thought there was a bigger, issue? If he just rolled the grenade under the tent before he left, it would all come out? Or do you think he knew this wasn't a big issue and he just wanted to smear people?
Russell Moore hates Ronnie Floyd. He hates Mike Stone. He is not especially pleasant toward the Conservative Baptist Network. At the time he did this, we had 5 of the 7 officers of the executive committee, and Ronnie's the president of the EC. And the EC, a year and a half earlier, had voted to investigate whether the ERLC's antics were causing a decline in cooperative program gifts.
So it was
that's why he did this. It was payback.
Yep.
It was pure payback, and he did it on his way out the door. I said from the beginning, if he had personal knowledge of actual sex abuse at the executive committee, he had a duty under the Tennessee mandatory reporter law to call 911, which he never did. We are now 2.5 years later, and Russell Moore has never once called the police about any of these acts he said he had personal knowledge of. He's either a criminal or a liar, and the investigation proves he's just a liar.
Mm-hmm. And he claimed to be a lifelong Baptist, and now what? He's at a Presbyterian church, right? He's just...
Oh, yeah. He went directly from being what amounts to a Baptist archbishop to the staff of a Presbyterian church. And of course, a chair at Christianity Today. But no, he goes straight to a woke Presbyterian church. And of course, his wife, Beth, went straight to an Anglican church. So, they're such Southern Baptists.
You have to correct that. Really there might be someone who watches this program that thinks that that's true. They're not related to each other, for the record.
They are not related.
But we like to make the joke anyway.
But they are close friends, and they've been partners in crime on all of this introduction of left-wing politics, and that's really all it is. You look at I saw an article that Capstone Report published the other day, and they had done some kind of research and found that 79% of political contributions from staff at Lifeway Christian Resources went to Democrats. There's a reason.
If I could just pat ourselves on the back a little bit, that was our research that they.
Well, congratulations, good for you.
That was our staff writer.
Well, what comes out of that is plain as day. There's a reason these guys have spent the last decade telling you to depoliticize, telling you to get out of the public square. It's because they're all Democrats, and they know that 86% of you aren't. Mm-hmm. So they don't want you talking about issues that matter to you, because that actually directly opposes their actual agenda. This is really the thing. It's not about politics from my point of view. It's about the gospel. But the Democratic Party and its adherents have been completely captured by critical theory. Critical theory posits, for those who understand, it's a repackaging of Marxism. But ignoring that, let's just cut to the chase. It posits a false gospel. It says, whether you're talking about critical race theory, queer theory, radical feminism, whatever, all of it says that there is one group of people who never has to repent and another group of people who never gets to. It is the exact opposite of biblical reconciliation. You're talking about racial reconciliation earlier. That's what we've been hearing nonstop for a decade. There's no reconciliation in it. There's only racial polarization in it. Kingdom race theology that Tony Evans and Bart Barber are now pushing. It's just CRT with a different letter. That's all it is. And it's aimed at Christianizing something that is fundamentally anti-Christian. It is about getting you to constantly be at enmity with your neighbor in the name of loving them, but they must never forgive you. They must always remember every perceived slight, real or imagined, and you must always remember it too and constantly do penance forever. And it's not just you, because we know Tabiti got up at the MLK 50 conference, on Russell Moore's platform and told us that every single white person in the United States, no matter what their age, is individually responsible for the assassination of Martin Luther King. So my 6-year-old granddaughter, and by the way, I've got all this gray hair. I was born after King was assassinated. My 6-year-old granddaughter, born after us, obviously, is personally responsible for King's assassination. And Black people need to constantly be upset at her and at me and at you, because we have to remember all these things. So, for all these CRT/KRT reasons. No, that's a devil's lie. That is about the opposite of reconciliation. That is about hating thy neighbor. That is absolutely a concoction designed to keep everyone at each other's throats forever. If you want reconciliation, there's one way, and it's Jesus. There is no Jew or Greek. There is no slave or free. There is no male or female. We are all one in Christ. We are all adopted by one Father. We all have the same inheritance, which we share as co-heirs with Christ. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight, as I grew up singing. It is absolutely the opposite of racialism, and they are reintroducing it for one purpose, and you have seen it in the country, and you have seen it in companies, and now you're seeing it in the churches. It is about power. Mm-hmm. And they have executed a coup d'etat everywhere for the purpose of, they say, tearing down hierarchies. What they leave out is they have a new hierarchy they mean to replace those hierarchies with.
Well, and I saw it in NAM literature, Send Network literature, with Dottie Lewis basically saying the Great Commission also includes, I think he called it the Great Requirement. Like the gospel isn't the gospel is the gospel, but there's so much more that you don't know about, that has to do with social justice and redistribution and caring for the poor, and guys like Dwight McKissick will get on Twitter and talk about, remember how Jesus said he's bringing this, he's taking care of the poor here, of course, missing the fact that this was about salvation, the poor in spirit. Right. If you forgot about that, it's pretty deep.
We do care about the poor. We absolutely do. And speaking as a poor kid from Arkansas, I grew up in a town that is so Southern. Our mascot was the Ozark Hillbillies, for heaven's sake. We had one industry. It was a chicken plant. Come on. I'm a poor kid from Arkansas, and I got to go out and be part of starting PayPal, which is an absolute legend in the annals of history. I've gotten to do all kinds of things because in America, we have followed the dictates of Scripture sufficiently, not stealing, not coveting, not doing things that God puts off limits, which all these people want to put back on the table. Socialism is nothing but an institutionalization of a 10th commandment violation. We have the opportunity in America to do whatever our spiritual gifts allow us to do, and create tremendous opportunities for poor people. The proudest thing that we achieved at PayPal in the 2.5 years we were there before we sold it to eBay was not the 25 million users we got to, which is quite a few more than the zero we had when we started. It's the 2 million small businesses we facilitated the creation of in that same 2.5 years. That's single moms and widows and people who have nothing having a way to make a future for themselves on their own terms from their own homes. Sometimes, start an office, start a company, hire a bunch of people who now have economic opportunity because of what we did. And there was no money there. And none of us had anything. And, our chief technical officer was a refugee from the Soviet Union. None of these people have anything. The average age of the staff was 23. We were able to build it because America largely still operates on some semblance of biblical law. And under the rules that Scripture puts down, we have the freedom to use our mind to create in the same way that our Father is a creator. We imitate that as we are imitators of Christ, and we reflect that creativeness in our image bearing, and we're able to use whatever He gives us to make things better, to push back at the curse, to actually make poor people have opportunities they would never otherwise have. And what they would have us do is just redistribution. So you literally make everybody poorer. A few people have a little bit more as a result of that, but you've given them a fish. You haven't taught them to fish.
Yeah.
You've done nothing for their soul, and you've certainly done nothing for their sustainability. The word that the left always uses but does not understand.
And the way that I always argued it from a Christian perspective is when you use the government to care for the poor. Christian caring for the poor has a very specific purpose, which is to present poor people who are materially poor with their real poverty, their real need, which is for Jesus Christ, right?
Absolutely.
And when you use the government to care for the poor, where does the glory go? It doesn't go to Jesus. It goes to the government.
Well, that's exactly right. And it glorifies things that are wrong. If I delegate to government my charity, there's no charity in that at all. I become hardened to the actual charitable needs in front of me because, hey, government will do that. I don't need to give my money. We have a government for that.
That's why you find liberals not giving to charity.
Oh, yes. And you see it. You see it in their tax returns. You saw when Al Gore was running for president, they got, he submitted his tax returns. He had given $364 to charity in the preceding year. Well, why should he? He believes that government is a charity. So it makes sense that he would do it that way. But what's he giving of himself? Absolutely nothing. And likewise, you're stunning the opportunity of people to make more of themselves, to be creative as our Father is creative, to carry out the parable of the talents and the parable of the minas. Of course, those have a spiritual component, but they have a material component too. Jesus spends a lot of time talking about taking care of widows and orphans and doing unto the least of these. Well, you actually have to have some ability to do that. It's easier for me to take care of. I have an old friend from high school, and her daughter is in jail. She called me from jail a couple days ago, and I'm trying to arrange bond to get her out. Well, her family can't afford to pay the bond. They don't have the resources to do it. I worked, at something that made a little bit more money than they did. They all worked just as hard, but I did something that was a little bit more creative, and so I have a little bit more. I can afford to take care of her. I'm going to get her out of jail. I hope she's innocent because I'm going to get her out of jail. But that's possible because we followed certain rules that are in Scripture. And when they teach a twisting of those rules, they're not helping the poor. They're not reconciling the races. They're not doing the things they say they're doing, even if they think they are. The reality is God actually does know best. And when we follow His laws, when we follow His word, we actually get down that road. When you perpetuate grievance and victimhood to all generations, you're not reconciling anybody. you're just creating enmity. It is the opposite of loving your neighbor as yourself. And we have to defeat that. And it is a thing you defeat. You don't just argue with it. You don't just argue about it. You actually got to show up at a business meeting for 2 days a year and vote against it. Yeah, that's actually the truth. And you need to do it at your state convention too. And you need to do it at your state and national elections too. The left never attacks us on just one front. They are always everywhere. And we have to actually proclaim the crown rights of King Jesus in all things everywhere, but nowhere so much as in his own church.
So I appreciate everything you said. I appreciate you being here, Rod, for sure. We're running low on time for the free portion of the podcast. Do you want to stay around? I wanted to talk about Bart Barber. We ran a little bit out of time, but if you want to stay for the patron portion, I have some questions to ask you about Bart Barber, who I've been very vocal against for the past I don't know, a few years or so, but of course, Protestia, Pulpit and Pen has been vocal against them for much longer than that. So, thank you so much for those of you that have tuned in for this portion. If you are a patron, stay tuned or look for that other link. I'm not sure I'm going to post this yet, but you can look for that other link in your Patreon feed for the patron portion. For everybody else, we'll see you next time. God bless, and as always, Semper Reformanda.